A shy newcomer was being bullied at work. One day, she didn't have enough money for a pastry. The head of the company, a single father, was standing behind her. This quiet gesture changed everything. Later, she saved his business. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city you are watching from. Emily Harper arrived in the city with a single battered suitcase and a laptop that had seen better days. The bus from her small hometown had rattled for hours through fields and low hills, its windows fogged by autumn rain, until the skyline rose ahead of her like a wall of glass and ambition. She had dreamed of this moment for years, telling herself that if she worked hard enough, saved every extra dollar, and believed in something better, she could build a new life. Yet as she stepped out into the rushing crowd and smelled the wet pavement, the weight of everything she had left behind pressed heavily on her shoulders. Her mother's frail voice echoed in her mind, thanking her for every pill and doctor visit Emily's sacrifices had paid for. Her father's old jacket hung on her arm, worn at the elbows, its fabric soft from years of use. She carried her past with her, whether she liked it or not. The company that had hired her, Hayden Global Ventures, was nothing like the small insurance office where she had once filed papers back home. Its headquarters loomed over the financial district, a tower of steel and tinted glass, with a lobby so vast it felt like a cathedral to success. Inside, the air smelled faintly of polished marble and expensive coffee. Screens displayed market data and promotional videos of innovative projects. Everyone seemed to know where they were going and why. Emily clutched the strap of her bag a little tighter as she crossed the lobby and introduced herself to the receptionist. Her voice trembled slightly. She hoped it was masked by the clatter of heels on the glossy floor. She had imagined her first day differently, perhaps with a warm welcome or at least polite indifference. Instead, the atmosphere in the strategic development department was brisk, efficient, and edged with the kind of casual cruelty that thrived in offices where appearances mattered as much as skill. When she was introduced to the team, smiles appeared, but they were brief and perfunctory. One of the younger analysts, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit, let his gaze travel from her plain blouse to the scuffed corners of her laptop before turning away with a smirk. Two women at a nearby desk exchanged looks that said everything words didn't need to. Emily felt her cheeks heat, but forced a professional smile. She needed this job. She needed the salary and the health insurance, and the chance to climb out of the hole her life had become. She spent the morning trying to disappear into her work, carefully reviewing onboarding documents, setting up her workstation, and listening to the rhythm of the office around her. Conversations flowed with an ease she didn't have. They were filled with references to universities she had never dreamed of attending, internships in cities she had never visited, and vacations that cost more than she had ever earned in a year. Whenever she looked up, she saw confidence expensive watches, perfect hair, polished self-assurance. It was another world, and she felt painfully out of place. By noon, her stomach growled, but she hesitated to join the others heading to lunch. She had noticed them forming small groups, laughing quietly as they moved toward the elevators. No one had invited her. She told herself it didn't matter, that she would adjust in time, but the isolation stung. She took out the modest lunch she had packed, peanut butter on whole wheat, an apple, and ate quickly at her desk, keeping her head down while emails pinged in and out of her inbox. What she didn't know was that somewhere several floors above, the man who had built this empire was having a very different day. Alexander Hayden had arrived early, as he always did, but today his 6-year-old daughter Sophia was with him. Their nanny had fallen ill overnight, and rather than cancel meetings or leave his child with a stranger, Alexander had bundled the little girl into the back seat of his sleek black SUV and brought her along. The office was used to seeing Sophia from time to time, Her dark curls and curious eyes had a way of softening the atmosphere whenever she appeared, reminding even the most hard-driven executives that life was more than quarterly reports. Alexander himself was a man people noticed without trying. At 42, he had the calm authority of someone who had survived failure and built success with his own hands. Widowed young, he had dedicated the last 5 years to raising Sophia, while expanding the company he had founded in his 20s. Stories about him circulated through the building, how he had personally helped an entry-level engineer relocate when tragedy struck, how he refused to tolerate arrogance, how he quietly supported scholarships for single parents. Yet most employees only glimpsed him from a distance, at all-hands meetings, or during brief walkthroughs of departments. Emily had heard his name, of course. She knew he was the owner, but to her, he was an abstract figure, someone powerful and unreachable. The afternoon passed slowly. Emily kept her head down, finishing required trainings and watching the clock. When a handful of analysts gathered behind her to whisper about a recent deal, one of them made a pointed remark about junior hires who looked like they bought their wardrobe at a thrift store. Laughter followed. She didn't turn around. Her throat burned, but she pressed her lips together and stayed silent. She had promised herself she wouldn't cry at work. By the time her shift ended, the day felt like a quiet defeat. She packed up carefully, tucking her old laptop into its sleeve and slipping her father's jacket over her shoulders. Outside, the city was alive with lights and honking horns. People moved quickly, umbrellas bobbing as rain began to fall again. She told herself that tomorrow would be better, but part of her wondered if she had made a mistake leaving home. The next morning was worse. Emails piled up with tasks she didn't fully understand yet, and when she asked a polite question, the same analyst who had mocked her clothes gave a sigh heavy with impatience before answering. She ate her meager lunch at her desk again, but the isolation was starting to feel unbearable. She thought of her mother and the medical bills that waited at the end of each month. Giving up wasn't an option, yet the sense of being unwelcome gnawed at her. When the lunch hour came on her third day, she decided she needed a small kindness for herself. The company cafeteria felt too intimidating, filled with people who would glance at her tray and judge. Instead, she slipped out and wandered down the street until she found a small bakery cafe with warm light and the scent of sugar drifting out its door. Inside, it was cozy chalkboard menus, glass cases filled with glossy pastries, soft music humming from a speaker. For the first time in days, Emily felt a little comfort. She told herself she deserved one sweet thing, just to remind herself she was alive. She chose a modest slice of cake, something simple and cheerful. At the counter, she smiled nervously at the cashier and pulled out her debit card. When the total flashed on the screen, her heart skipped. It was more than she'd expected. She swiped anyway, but the machine beeped with denial. Flustered, she tried again. The same result. The cashier gave her an apologetic but impatient look, and Emily felt heat crawl up her neck. Behind her, the line shifted. Someone cleared their throat. She opened her wallet and saw only a few crumpled bills, less than the price of the cake. Panic fluttered in her chest. She could walk away, but humiliation pinned her in place. After all the small indignities of the past few days, this felt like the worst. She didn't see the man behind her at first. Alexander had stepped into the shop quietly. Sophia perched comfortably on his hip. One small arm looped around his neck as she looked curiously at the desserts. He had been planning to grab a coffee and a snack for his daughter before their next meeting. But as he waited, he noticed the young woman in front of him. Something in her posture, the rigid back, the trembling hands as she fumbled with her wallet, caught his attention. He watched long enough to understand what was happening. When Emily finally stammered that she didn't have enough and started to step aside, mortified, a calm voice reached the cashier. Alexander handed over his card with an ease that made the moment feel less like charity and more like an everyday kindness. He added a few extra treats to the order macarons for Sophia, another pastry for the woman in front of him, and smiled gently at his daughter when she asked something quiet he alone could hear. Emily turned in shock, eyes wide as she realized who had stepped in. She knew his face from the company's website, from the framed photos in the lobby. For a second, she couldn't breathe. But Alexander said nothing to embarrass her. No lecture, no grand gesture. Just a simple, human action, done with respect. She managed a whisper of gratitude, still burning with shame, but also something new relief, perhaps, or the faintest spark of hope. As she carried the small white box out into the cool air, she felt different. The humiliation still stung, but it was tempered by the unexpected warmth of someone who didn't need to care, but did. For the first time since arriving, she felt that maybe the world wasn't entirely hostile. She thought about the man who had helped her, and about his little girl watching with quiet curiosity. She straightened her back as she walked back to the office. It was a tiny moment, easily lost in the noise of a city where millions of lives brushed past one another. But for Emily, it marked the first crack in the wall of fear and loneliness that had surrounded her since she stepped off the bus. She didn't know yet that this single act of quiet kindness would ripple outward, changing not just her future, but the very culture of the company she had feared would swallow her whole. For now, she only knew that she had been seen, and it gave her strength to keep going. The next morning dawned gray and heavy, the kind of city morning that felt as though the sky had forgotten how to lift itself. Emily woke early, long before her alarm, in the small rented room she had found on the cheaper side of town. The radiator ticked, but gave little warmth, and the single window leaked a faint draft of autumn air. She stared at the ceiling for a while, listening to the city wake distant traffic, a siren far away, someone yelling to catch a bus, and tried to gather the will to rise. Her bank app still glowed in her mind, the humiliating balance she had checked the night before, mocking her efforts to start over. The incident at the bakery lingered in her chest like a bruise. It was strange. She had felt both mortified and strangely lifted by the quiet kindness she had received. She hadn't told anyone, of course. She had no one to tell. And besides, she suspected such small human gestures didn't matter to the kind of people she worked with. Still, the memory of the man's calm presence and his small daughter, watching her with soft, curious eyes, had followed her into her dreams. She dressed carefully, choosing the neatest blouse she owned and brushing her hair until it shone, though she still felt shabby compared to the polished elegance she had seen in the office. As she made her way through crowded subway cars and damp streets, she told herself that today had to be better. She had survived the humiliation of the cafe, and maybe, just maybe, it could be a turning point rather than the breaking point it had felt like. In the office, nothing seemed different at first. The strategic development floor was already humming with activity when she arrived. Screens glowed with spreadsheets, and the usual quiet laughter passed between clusters of desks. The same analysts who had mocked her before barely looked up when she sat down. She opened her laptop, trying to focus on the day's tasks, but her nerves frayed each time she sensed eyes on her. She felt invisible and conspicuous all at once. What she didn't know was that elsewhere in the building, Alexander Hayden was also beginning his day, this time with his daughter once again by his side. Sophia had loved their small detour to the bakery the day before and insisted they go again. Alexander rarely let his personal life mingle with the company's business hours, but he was a single father, and sometimes life demanded flexibility. The previous afternoon's brief encounter had stayed with him as well, though he hadn't let it show. He had noticed the young woman's embarrassment, the way she tried to disappear, and it had reminded him of a time long ago when he had stood in someone else's world, feeling just as small. Success hadn't erased those memories. If anything, it had made him more sensitive to the quiet struggles that went unseen. That day's work was relentless for Emily. She was assigned a series of data pulls and market summaries tasks, simple enough, but endless, eating up her hours. She focused, grateful for something she could do well, even if it kept her isolated. At one point, while printing a report, she overheard two employees joking about a recent merger and casually referring to new blood that doesn't know how to dress for the city. She wasn't sure if they meant her, but the words still stung. She kept her head down and returned to her desk. By mid-morning, exhaustion pressed in, heavier than it should have for such a simple day. The office lights felt harsh, the buzz of conversation a steady reminder that she didn't belong. Her phone buzzed with a text from her landlord about rent due soon. Her throat tightened. She thought of home, of the creaky porch and quiet nights when the loudest sound had been crickets. She had dreamed of escaping, but here she felt like an intruder in someone else's story. When lunch arrived, she couldn't bear another meal at her desk. She needed to breathe, to step outside the walls that seemed to shrink closer each hour. So she left the building and wandered down the street, following the memory of the little bakery. The warm smell of butter and sugar reached her before she even saw the door. It was the kind of place that reminded her of childhood Saturdays, small-town fairs, and homemade pies cooling on windowsills. She hesitated on the threshold, then stepped inside, clutching the small billfold in her bag. She had just enough for something modest, she thought, if she chose carefully. The shop was nearly empty, sunlight pooling on wooden floors. She studied the glass case with its neat rows of pastries and cakes, heart fluttering at the thought of one small indulgence to make the day feel less harsh. She picked something simple, a small tart, glossy with fruit, and moved toward the counter. The cashier greeted her absently and rang up the total. It was $1 more than she had counted on. She swallowed, trying to keep her face neutral as she opened her wallet. She had the bills, but not enough coins to cover tax. Panic prickled again, raw and familiar. She fumbled for her debit card, praying it would go through despite yesterday's rejection. The machine beeped once, twice, then displayed the same cold refusal. Heat rose up her neck, her pulse pounding in her ears. Behind her, the bell over the door chimed softly. She didn't look. She couldn't. Someone shifted impatiently in line. The cashier's expression stayed polite, but edged with that faint impatience of city workers who had seen every awkward scene. Emily felt herself shrinking, humiliated and desperate to vanish. She muttered something about putting it back and began to step aside. A calm voice intervened, not loud, but steady enough to halt the moment. "I'll take care of that," the man behind her said, and a sleek black card appeared on the counter. Emily turned, startled, and time seemed to blur. There he was. Alexander Hayden, the man whose name was etched in brass in the building she worked in, the man whose company now paid her wages. He was taller than she had expected, dressed simply in a dark coat, his hair just beginning to silver at the temples. On his hip, Sophia clung with shy curiosity, her wide brown eyes fixed on Emily with the frank openness only a child could have. Alexander's face was calm, kind, without being pitying. He didn't study her clothes or her awkwardness. He simply completed the transaction as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world. He added a few extra pastries to the order, handing Sophia one with a small smile before passing the bag toward Emily. "Take it," he said softly, though not in a way that demanded or patronized. It was more like an invitation to accept a shared human moment. Emily's breath caught. She stammered a thank you, cheeks burning with a mix of gratitude and embarrassment. He only nodded once, adjusting Sophia on his arm, and giving the faintest smile before turning back to order his own coffee. There was no fanfare, no announcement of who he was or why he had helped. He didn't even wait for her to finish speaking before gently shifting the conversation toward his daughter, as if to spare her further discomfort. She walked out into the cool air, clutching the small white box, her steps slow and unsteady. The humiliation of not having enough still lingered, but it was softened by something unexpected. Dignity. Somehow, he had managed to help her without stripping her of it. For the first time in days, she felt seen in a way that wasn't cruel. The man who could have ignored her had chosen not to. And the little girl's curious, gentle gaze stayed with her, a quiet reminder that kindness left traces beyond the moment. Back at her desk, Emily set the pastry carefully beside her computer and stared at it for a long time. She didn't eat right away. Instead, she thought about how small acts could feel enormous when life was heavy. She thought about the difference between generosity that humiliates and generosity that lifts. And she thought about how maybe, just maybe, this city wasn't as cold as it had seemed. That afternoon, something subtle shifted in her. She sat a little straighter. She found the courage to ask a clarifying question about the report she was compiling, and though the response was curt, she held her ground without shrinking. Alexander, for his part, returned to the office and moved through his day as though nothing unusual had happened. He never mentioned the incident to anyone. Yet he found himself watching for the young woman later when he passed through the strategic development floor. He didn't interrupt or linger, but he noted her quiet diligence, the way she kept her head down yet worked with precision. There was something in her that reminded him of his younger self, back when he had been overlooked in rooms full of power. He wondered how many like her were lost to discouragement before they had a chance to prove themselves. The city outside glittered as evening fell, lights flickering on across glass towers. Emily rode the subway home tired, but somehow lighter. Her room was still drafty, her bank account still thin, but something inside her had steadied. She ate the tart slowly at her small desk, savoring every bite, not just for its sweetness, but for what it represented, a moment of unexpected grace in a world that often felt merciless. She didn't yet know what would follow, how this quiet gesture would ripple into her work and her sense of self. But as she closed her eyes that night, the shame of the day before felt a little less sharp, and a fragile determination began to grow in its place. In the grand scheme of things, nothing visible had changed. She was still the outsider, the newcomer with the old laptop and the too-plain wardrobe. The office would still test her in subtle, cutting ways. But something had shifted deep inside, a seed of resilience, watered by a stranger's kindness. Tomorrow, she would return to her desk and try again. And somewhere, a man who had once known the sting of invisibility would remember the girl at the bakery and decide to keep an eye on her, not with favoritism, but with the quiet support of someone who understood what it meant to fight your way in from the edges. The following weeks unfolded slowly, like a hesitant spring breaking through winter. Nothing about Emily's circumstances changed overnight. Her bank balance remained fragile, the city stayed loud and indifferent, and the office still buzzed with the same quiet hierarchies that had left her feeling small. Yet something inside her had shifted after that afternoon in the bakery. The memory of Alexander Hayden's calm kindness and his daughter's curious, gentle gaze worked on her in subtle ways. The humiliation she had felt in that moment no longer weighed her down as a failure. Instead, it seemed to whisper that perhaps she was worth seeing, that perhaps she didn't have to disappear to survive. That new, almost imperceptible confidence began to seep into the edges of her days. She arrived earlier now, giving herself time to breathe before the floor filled with chatter. She organized her tasks with care, determined to show herself capable, even if no one seemed to expect it. When her direct supervisor asked for updates, she answered clearly, forcing herself not to mumble or retreat. Small victories accumulated, an accurate report praised for its thoroughness, a market trend she spotted before others did, a spreadsheet she built that saved hours for the team. At first, these successes went mostly unnoticed, but her quiet persistence began to draw small nods from people who had ignored her before. She still overheard whispered jokes now and then, but they no longer crushed her the way they had. She had seen kindness at the highest level of the company, and that knowledge gave her an odd kind of armor. Alexander remained a distant presence in her day-to-day life, but he seemed to pass by the strategic development department a little more often than before. Sometimes it was only a brief glance, as he checked in on progress. Sometimes he lingered just long enough to speak with department heads. Emily never spoke to him directly, but she sensed that he remembered her. He didn't make her feel watched in a way that would be embarrassing. It was more like the steady, unseen awareness of someone who had decided not to let her drown. The thought made her both nervous and strangely safe. One morning, just as winter loosened its grip on the city, Emily's manager stopped by her desk with an unexpected assignment. A new client was negotiating a deal that could expand the company's reach into an emerging market. The project was demanding, tight deadlines, shifting requirements, and a need for creative problem-solving. Normally, such assignments went to employees with far more tenure, but Alexander, having reviewed recommendations from senior staff, had quietly suggested giving the task to someone untested but promising. Emily's name surfaced. She was stunned when her manager told her she would be leading initial research and proposal development. At first, the weight of it nearly paralyzed her. She spent that night awake in her small room, staring at the ceiling, wondering if she had been chosen only to fail. But fear soon gave way to resolve. She had been given a rare chance. She would not waste it. The following day, she mapped out a plan, breaking the project into manageable parts. She spent long hours combing through reports, analyzing competitors, and brainstorming innovative strategies. Her approach was methodical, yet imaginative, shaped by the resourcefulness she had honed in years of making do with less. Around this time, Sophia began to appear more often on the floor where Emily worked. The little girl seemed fascinated by the energy of the office, though she always stayed close to her father when he brought her along. One afternoon, as Alexander discussed something with the head of development, Sophia wandered a few feet away and spotted Emily buried in market research. The child's natural curiosity pulled her forward. She lingered quietly at Emily's desk until Emily noticed and looked up, startled. Sophia offered a shy smile and showed her a crayon drawing she had been carrying. Bright swirls of color, a house, a sun. Emily smiled back, charmed by the simple, unguarded gesture. It was only a moment, but it felt like a bridge, a tiny thread of connection to a world that had seemed so close to her. From then on, whenever Sophia visited, she sought Emily out. Sometimes she left little doodles on sticky notes. Sometimes she waved from across the room before Alexander gently ushered her back. These brief encounters didn't go unnoticed. A few co-workers teased lightly about Emily being the kid's favorite, though the tone was more curious than cruel. Still, Emily felt a new warmth in the office, a sense that she wasn't entirely invisible. But not everyone responded kindly. As Emily's work on the project gained traction, whispers began to circle. A pair of analysts, who had once smirked at her quiet arrival, now watched her with thinly veiled resentment. They suggested to others that her sudden assignment might have less to do with merit and more to do with proximity to the boss. One afternoon, as she walked past the break room, she caught the tail end of a sentence. Funny how some people get noticed after a run-in with the right person. Laughter followed. The words pierced, even though she tried to shrug them off. She hadn't asked for Alexander's help, hadn't sought any special attention. Yet now, it seemed to be counted against her. She fought to keep her focus. The project was complex, with moving parts that shifted by the day. A potential partner wavered on terms. Budgets were revised downward. Timelines were cut unexpectedly. More than once, she found herself working late into the night, her old laptop glowing in the dim light of her room as she built models and drafted strategies. There were moments of doubt so strong they made her hands shake. She would pause, breathing through the fear that she wasn't enough for this, that failure would confirm every whispered suspicion. But each time, she remembered the calm steadiness in Alexander's eyes at the bakery. He had helped her with dignity. Now she would honor that belief by proving herself. Her direct supervisor, initially skeptical, began to take note. He saw how she organized meetings with clarity, how she anticipated problems before they erupted, how she offered solutions rather than excuses. When unexpected obstacles arose, data gaps, vendor delays, she adapted quickly. He found himself relying on her more than he had intended. In meetings, her voice, though still soft, grew steadier. She wasn't loud or brash. She simply knew her work and presented it well. One late evening, when most of the office had emptied, she was still at her desk reviewing risk models. Alexander happened to walk past on his way to an executive meeting. He paused just long enough to notice the solitary glow of her screen. He didn't interrupt, but a faint, approving smile flickered across his face as he continued on. The next morning, she found a note from her manager authorizing additional resources for her team. A subtle, silent reinforcement that someone high above believed in what she was doing. Despite her progress, the undercurrent of envy didn't disappear. The two analysts who had mocked her early on grew sharper in their gossip. They hinted that she was a pet project of the CEO, that her ideas were getting more credit than they deserved. Such rumors had a way of spreading quietly, seeping into casual conversation. Emily could feel the shift in the air when she entered a room, a mix of respect from some and suspicion from others. It hurt, but she reminded herself that she hadn't cheated her way here. She was working harder than she ever had in her life. The stress built as the project neared its first major milestone. A crucial partner threatened to back out, citing concerns over logistics and market volatility. The decision risked unraveling weeks of work. Emily stayed late again, combing through data and case studies, searching for a way to reassure them without inflating projections. She crafted a bold yet realistic strategy that reframed the risks as opportunities, backed by fresh analytics. When she presented it to her manager, he hesitated, but agreed to take it to the next meeting. That night, Emily walked home exhausted, but alive with a strange fire. She understood now that this city might never fully welcome her. Some people would always look for an explanation other than merit when someone unexpected succeeded. But she was beginning to believe she could withstand that scrutiny. The bakery moment had been a spark. The work she was doing now was the fire it had lit. Sophia's small acts of friendship helped more than anyone guessed. On particularly hard days, when whispers cut deep, a crayon drawing tucked under her keyboard reminded her of simple, unguarded kindness. Once, Sophia drew a tall building with a tiny figure at the bottom and a rainbow arching over it. Emily didn't know if the child had meant anything by it, but she kept the picture pinned discreetly in her drawer. It felt like a quiet promise that someone saw her climbing. Alexander, true to form, remained distant enough not to fuel rumors, but present enough to protect her work when necessary. He pushed for her proposals to be reviewed on their merits and quietly discouraged dismissive comments from higher-ups. He knew from experience that talent could be crushed under envy long before it had a chance to prove itself. Watching Emily navigate the challenges with quiet determination reminded him of his own early battles. By the end of the quarter, the project was teetering between breakthrough and collapse. The stakes were higher than anyone had predicted. Success would mean opening an entire new revenue stream. Failure could make the company look reckless. Emily felt the pressure in every muscle of her body. Nights blurred into mornings as she refined strategies and prepared contingency plans. She didn't talk about the strain to anyone. There was no one to tell, but she carried it with a grim kind of pride. She had wanted a chance. This was it. And somewhere, deep beneath the exhaustion and fear, another feeling had begun to grow. A quiet, hard-won confidence. She was no longer the invisible girl eating lunch alone at her desk. She was shaping something real, something people higher up were watching. The road ahead was still full of risk and resistance, but she was walking it now, one determined step at a time. The moment of reckoning was coming fast. She didn't know yet how much would be asked of her before the end, or how the next challenge would test her courage in ways she hadn't imagined. For now, she only knew that the seed planted by a small act of dignity had taken root and begun to grow, even as shadows of envy tried to choke it. Tomorrow, she would step into a room filled with doubt and try to prove, once again, that she belonged. And somewhere, Alexander Hayden would be waiting quietly to see if the young woman he had once helped in a bakery could rise above the whispers and deliver something extraordinary. The weeks that followed turned into a blur of late nights and relentless pressure. The project that had begun as a promising experiment now carried the weight of the company's reputation. Every decision Emily made seemed to echo far beyond her desk. Market conditions shifted unexpectedly. A key vendor hesitated, and the partner she had fought so hard to keep engaged threatened once more to abandon the deal. Inside the department, tension grew palpable. People whispered about the possibility of failure, about budgets already stretched thin, about whether the company had gambled too much on an unproven hire. For Emily, every whisper felt like a blade sharpened against her resolve. Yet, somehow, the more precarious things became, the more fiercely she clung to the work. She had built her plans carefully, but the crisis demanded more than caution. It required courage. Each night after the office emptied and the lights dimmed, she remained at her desk, papers scattered and screens glowing, determined to find a way through. The city outside her window pulsed with indifferent life traffic, distant sirens, rain that streaked the glass, and she worked on, uncelebrated, unseen, but unwilling to give up. The old voice in her head that once told her she didn't belong was quieter now. In its place had grown a steadier, stronger voice. You have earned this. You can do this. One evening, after a particularly brutal day of negotiations, she sat staring at data that refused to bend the story she needed it to tell. Exhaustion blurred the numbers. She pushed back from her desk, massaging her temples, close to tears. Then she remembered the bakery, the quiet voice that had stepped in when she was humiliated, the man who had given her a small kindness without turning it into spectacle. She thought of his daughter's bright eyes and simple trust. Somehow, the memory steadied her hands. If someone like Alexander Hayden had believed she was worth a second look, she could believe it too. She stayed until dawn, drafting a new proposal that reframed the partnership not as a risk, but as an adaptive, forward-thinking opportunity that would give the company a competitive edge. When she finally presented the strategy, her supervisor hesitated, but the logic was unshakable. The plan acknowledged every danger with sober realism, but offered inventive ways to pivot if markets turned. It was bolder than what others had suggested, but it was also honest and well-supported. Word of her work reached the upper floors quickly. Alexander himself reviewed the proposal in his office, eyes narrowing as he took in the quiet audacity behind it. He recognized something of his younger self in the way she had faced fear head-on and built a way forward. The days that followed were brutal. Meetings stacked on meetings, calls stretched late into the night as the company scrambled to stabilize the deal. Emily sat through rooms filled with senior executives, many of whom looked at her with thinly veiled skepticism. She felt their doubts like static in the air, but refused to shrink. When questions came, she answered with clarity, her research ready, her analysis sound. Some senior managers tried to poke holes in her plan. She addressed each challenge with calm precision. At first, the room seemed almost eager for her to fail, but as she held her ground, something shifted. Respect began to replace doubt, even among those who had dismissed her. Alexander attended one of the final strategy sessions. He sat quietly at the far end of the polished table, Sophia absent that day, but present in the warmth behind his eyes. He let others speak, let them question. But when Emily's voice faltered slightly under the weight of yet another skeptical query, he leaned forward just enough to ask the doubter to consider the data she had laid out. His support was subtle, but unmistakable, a quiet endorsement that cut through the lingering bias in the room. No one dared to mock or dismiss her after that. The turning point came when the wavering partner agreed to continue, impressed by the clarity and adaptability of the revised plan. The company secured the deal, and the announcement swept through the building like a fresh wind. What had seemed destined for quiet collapse had turned into a triumph. Senior leadership praised the project's innovative approach in a company-wide memo, and for the first time, Emily's name appeared alongside those of seasoned executives. She read the words 3 times, hardly believing they were real. The shift in the office was immediate and complicated. People who had ignored her now offered quick congratulations in the hallway. Some who had whispered about favoritism grew silent, their gossip drowned out by undeniable results. Her supervisor, once reluctant, thanked her privately for saving the project, his face a mix of pride and mild surprise. Yet Emily understood that approval in such a place could be fragile. She accepted the praise with quiet grace, determined to let her work, not others' changing moods, define her worth. Still, the victory mattered. It mattered deeply. For the first time since stepping into the gleaming lobby of Hayden Global Ventures, she felt not like an intruder, but like someone who belonged. The shy young woman who had eaten lunch alone at her desk had become a professional whose insight shaped major decisions. And she had done it, without compromising her integrity, without seeking shortcuts, without losing the quiet dignity that had carried her through humiliation. The company held a celebration a few weeks after the deal closed. It wasn't lavish, just an evening gathering in a high-ceilinged atrium with music, light food, and a chance to breathe after months of strain. Emily arrived nervous, unused to such events, but colleagues greeted her warmly. She felt a tentative camaraderie she hadn't known before. As she stood near the edges of the crowd, sipping sparkling water, she saw Alexander enter with Sophia at his side. The little girl wore a pale blue dress and clutched a small, stuffed animal. Her eyes lit up when she spotted Emily. She tugged her father's sleeve and darted through the crowd with childlike confidence. Sophia reached her, and with the straightforward honesty only a child possesses, began to talk about the bakery. In her small, clear voice, she told a nearby group how her dad had once helped Emily buy a cake when her card didn't work, how he always said it was important to be kind when someone felt alone. Laughter rippled gently through the group, not mocking, but soft with surprise and warmth. People turned to look at Alexander, who had caught up to his daughter and now stood smiling, slightly bemused, but not embarrassed. He ruffled Sophia's curls and said nothing, letting her words stand. The story spread quickly through the gathering. Soon, people were glancing at Emily, not with suspicion, but with new understanding. The tale reframed everything. She wasn't the boss's pet project, but a woman who had been quietly noticed for her dignity and hardship and had proven her worth through undeniable work. The kindness that had begun in anonymity became a quiet legend that night, a reminder that Hayden Global's success was built not only on profit, but on humanity. Alexander didn't make a speech about it. He didn't draw attention to himself, or to her. He spent a few minutes speaking with senior staff, then found a moment to approach Emily. He congratulated her on the project with the same calm, understated warmth he had shown in the bakery months before. There was pride in his eyes, but also respect, the kind that recognizes not just achievement, but the courage it took to get there. Sophia beamed up at both of them, clearly delighted to see her father's kindness connected to such a triumph. As the evening wound down, Emily found herself standing alone for a moment, near the tall windows that looked out over the city. The skyline shimmered with 1,000 lights, each one a story unfolding. She thought of her journey, the bus ride, the humiliation, the long nights of doubt. She thought of the kindness that had met her at her lowest and the quiet strength it had sparked. She felt a deep, abiding gratitude, but also a hard-won pride. She had climbed from invisibility to recognition without losing herself. The next morning, she returned to work with the same quiet determination she had always carried, but now it felt different. People greeted her by name. Meetings included her voice without hesitation. The rumors of favoritism faded, replaced by respect earned the hard way. And somewhere deep inside, she felt a shift more profound than any outward success. The knowledge that she was capable, resilient, and worthy of the space she occupied. Alexander continued as he always had, neither distant nor overbearing. But his presence carried a subtle message that permeated the company. Success built on kindness was still success, and strength could coexist with humanity. Sophia, meanwhile, seemed thrilled to have played a part, even if only as the teller of a simple story. In her innocent way, she had reminded an entire room what truly mattered. Emily's life didn't become easy overnight. Bills still needed paying. Her mother's health still required attention, and the city remained an expensive, often unforgiving place. But now she faced it with a steadiness she had never known before. The fear that had once made her shrink into invisibility had been replaced by a quiet confidence, forged in struggle and grace. She often thought back to that first humiliating moment at the bakery. It had felt so small, so painful, yet it had changed everything. A single act of dignity had set off a chain reaction that carried her from isolation to belonging. She would never forget that, and she vowed silently that if ever she saw someone else standing small and frightened at the edges of this world, she would step forward too. She would pass the kindness on, quiet and unassuming, but powerful enough to alter a life. In the end, this was the true victory, not just the project's success or the recognition she had earned, but the transformation of fear into strength and loneliness into purpose. Emily Harper had arrived as an outsider. Now, she belonged not because she had adapted to the cruelty of the world, but because she had endured it without losing her humanity. And somewhere in an office high above the city, a man who had once known what it felt like to be overlooked allowed himself a small, private smile, grateful that a simple act of kindness had done what he had always hoped kindness could do: change the course of a life. If this story moved you, subscribe so you never miss the next one. Take a moment to watch the next video waiting for you right now. There are more stories worth discovering. And share this video with friends and family. Some journeys are too meaningful to keep to yourself.